So this video is for a viewer who I've actually made a previous video on this subject. This individual is adopting a dog in a little less than a month. So they've been asking, what should I look for when I'm going through the shelters, looking for a dog, looking online? Can you give any advice on this? So I made a previous video discussing something called shelter speak, which is the flowery, cutesy, humanizing language that you'll often see on online postings, or you may see in shelters when you're looking at bios, gathering information about the dogs that they have in their possession at the moment. So this is going to be more so just a part two of what do we look for? What should you look for when you go and you're selecting a dog that you think might be the best fit for you. Now, this individual is visually impaired. He's legally blind, as you would say. So his circumstances are a bit different. His needs are a bit different. However, the advice that I would give him isn't that much different than the advice I would give anybody else. Now, it's very, very difficult to navigate the shelter system, and it's very difficult to know exactly what kind of dog you're getting. And this is either due to information that was not given to the shelter employees, the dog not exhibiting certain characteristics or behavior traits until it is removed from the shelter environment back to a home setting. You know, dogs will exhibit another side of themselves typically once they have exited the stressful environment of the shelter and gone to a more comfortable place like a new home. So there's always an adjustment period anytime you bring a new dog home from a stressful environment like a shelter. You're never really going to know what that dog is about or the tendencies of that dog until you've had some time with it in a home environment. So that's the first tricky thing that we have to understand is, okay, I can be as thorough as I can be when I'm looking at dogs, meeting dogs, investigating dogs, but I should know that when I bring this dog home, it's likely that after a few days, a week, 2 weeks, I might see some new things pop up. This dog, there are going to be some new sides this dog may show me that I wasn't expecting. Now, of course, sometimes, and I'm not saying this is true most of the time, but there might be information that shelters know about that dog that they don't really want to tell you. I would say that as being an ethical question or an ethical issue, and I'm not saying that shelters do that. However, what you will see, and this is the shelter speak that I made a previous video on, is that you will see in their bios and the information that's given, they will attempt to hide or make light of serious issues, and they will use flowery and cutesy language to make these things seem humorous or light or like they're not that big of a deal when really they are. Now, I will tell you, when it came to my dogs, or I should say before I get into what happened with my dogs, the first question, and this isn't directed at this individual, but it's for anybody who may see this, because this individual has already answered this question for himself. But the thing that I want you to ask yourself is, why are you getting a dog? What is your reasoning? What is the purpose? Is this a fly-by-night sort of flippant, just like I woke up one day, I decided I wanted a dog? What is the reason and logic and purpose behind you doing so? It's a very important question to answer, because if you don't have a very good reason for getting one or a purpose behind it, I wouldn't recommend doing it. The other question you should ask yourself is, how much do I really know about this animal? How much do I really know about this animal, the dog? How much do you really know about dogs? It's a very important question that you should ask yourself before, if you are considering adopting one, you should really investigate that question. Because it's very, very important A lot of people get dogs, they don't know anything about them. They don't research them. They don't take the time trying to understand them. A lot of people end up adopting dogs for very selfish reasons. And then we wonder why we end up having problems, or why dogs end up oftentimes getting brought back to the shelter or rehomed or what have you. But not just about dogs. Let's say you're going to get a pit bull or German shepherd. How much do you know about that breed? And I'm not saying breed is everything, but if you're thinking about getting a Cane Corso or a pit bull or anything, any dog like that would require an experienced individual, how much do you know about that breed? How much do you know about what it's like to live with that breed? Because if you don't know anything about it, I would not get a German Shepherd, a Cane Corso, a pit bull, certain types of bulldogs. I wouldn't do it. The analogy I like to give, because I've had people ask me, like, Kevin, what's the one breed you recommend people don't get? And I always say Cane Corsos. But pit bulls are not far behind that. And the analogy I like to use is, all right, imagine you've never shot a gun before and you want to learn to shoot guns. Well, if you've never had a dog before and you want your first dog to be a pit bull, or I'm more so talking about Cane Corsos, adopting a Cane Corso is like never shooting a gun before and immediately going to pick up a machine gun and trying to shoot that as being your first time shooting a gun. Not a smart idea. It'd be better to, say, start with a handgun, something you can manage, something that for your size, weight, experience level, something that would be a good starting place, and work your way up. So a Cane Corso is like a machine gun. You'd want to start further down that scale. You know, a Golden Retriever, a Maltese, a lab, certain types of labs, a beagle, something like that. And even, listen, every breed has its quirks and issues and whatever, and of course breed is not everything. Within any breed there's always going to be a range of temperaments. So, as say chocolate labs have a reputation, right? Well, I've worked with, Grizzy on my channel. He's been on my channel many times. One of the hardest dogs I've ever worked with was Grizzy, a chocolate lab. So the breed, use it as a general rule of thumb, but it's not going to be everything. So what would I not now is when it came to my dogs, when I first adopted Kaylee, that she was my first dog. I did a bunch of research before I went in there. I was learning about dogs. I was soaking up all kinds of information. I was educating myself. And so when I first met Kaylee, and mind you, this is something I also want to convey is don't look for this grand emotional connection. A lot of times, I think people get in their heads where, like, you're going to go to the shelter and you're going to see this one dog and it's just going to hit you. You're just going to connect. You're going to be like, that's the one. Don't go off that. I've never done that myself, and I've known people who have done that, and the dog did not end up being what that connection they thought they had did not end up being the reality. Because a lot of times in our human mind, we will perceive things, especially if we don't know anything about dogs. You may meet a dog in a shelter and perceive this supposed bond you're building one way through your human eyes, but that dog doesn't see it the same way. You need to understand that feeling you're getting, because you're seeing things through an emotional lens, an emotionally driven human lens. That's not at all what the dog is experiencing. So when I met Kaylee, I had actually had a dog in mind that I really wanted to meet, and I had my eyes set on. And that dog ended up getting adopted from the Champaign County Humane Society. Well, One of my coworkers knew I was looking, and she's like, "Hey, Kevin, I found this other dog." And she showed me a picture of Kaylee, and I was actually like, "All right, I'll meet her." I wasn't all that interested based on the photo, but I went and met her. Kaylee was she's a very scared dog when I met her. There's a few of us in a little meeting room. She was shaking uncontrollably, just like frozen in fear. She didn't want to move. And the only thing I could think, I met her, I took some time to think about it, and I wasn't sold on her, but I gave it a couple of days and I thought, you know what? I believe I can help this dog. So it wasn't about me. It was about what can I do for this dog? And I'm so glad that I went with that, because even though I wasn't sold on Kaylee at first, she was right up there with Grey Goose as far as, like, you want to talk about top tier, just trophy, best fucking dog anybody could ever ask for. Kaylee. Love that dog. She was so good. So fucking good. That dog was incredible. Now, to my point earlier, she was shaking and scared in the shelter, whatever. I brought her home, right? Well, she basically spent 4 or 5 days on the couch. She had kennel cough. She's on the couch. She didn't really move much. Just curl up in a ball, just kind of getting used to things. Well, we would go for daily walks and whatnot. But she was very resistant on the leash. She didn't want to follow me. She would fight, and she'd slip out of the leash and run away. I mean, like, run away. And I'd go chase her down, and she ran away from me even more. She didn't want to follow me. And she was a bit rebellious. So it took some time to work through that and figure that out. But once we did, I mean, I would not be who I am without Kaylee. But then, of course, Bruno. Now, Bruno was the kind of dog where he didn't need an adjustment period. Bruno was Bruno. When I met Bruno, he was a certain way. When I brought Bruno home, if you've heard me talk about him in other videos, Bruno was a very dominant-minded dog. He wanted to control his environment. Very confident dog, very assertive dog. Bruno didn't give a fuck. Now, when I met Bruno, back then if you had a dog, you had to bring them to the shelter for a meet and greet to make sure everything, they got along. And of course, Kaylee and Bruno got along immaculately, 2 peas in a pod. But the first thing I noticed about Bruno was, they gave me some toys or whatever. I had toys in my hand, and he was jumping up on me to try to snatch the toys out of my hand with his mouth. He was very pushy, disrespectful, you could say. But because of his dominant personality. Now, Bruno was 1 year and 1 month old, and he had 2 owners already. And the last owner had kept him chained up outside 24 hours a day. And Bruno, also, the information that they had on the cage he was in, they said he was very destructive. The previous owners, just like, they didn't know what to do with him. Destructive, kept him chained up outside. It was no surprise to me why they got rid of him. I had suspected, due to his health conditions he had and his temperament towards certain dogs and people, that maybe he came from a dog fighting compound. I don't know. That's my best guess. But he was a fighter. Fight to kill. So, of course, when I brought him home, he immediately wanted to dominate Kaylee, wanted to dominate the environment. If you've heard me tell the story, tried to take food out of Kaylee's mouth. Didn't like the fact that I took it back from him. Went to pee on my bed. Things like that. But Bruno's also a good example of because he was pet of the week on the local news. And I've watched the clip. I tried to find it. I can't find it anymore. I think, it's been long since taken down. But he didn't exhibit any of these aggressive tendencies, I believe, with them, or even at the shelter. You see, Bruno was extremely smart, and I think Bruno knew to play his hand a certain way. So he didn't exhibit that until I brought him home. Now, maybe the shelter did know and they didn't want to tell me. I don't know. But he was a great example because I had no idea that he had any aggressive tendencies. I didn't discover that till I brought him home. And then I really didn't discover it till I began to bring him and Kaylee to the dog park. That's when I really started to see it. So I had no knowledge of that when I adopted him. But he also didn't really need an adjustment period either. He was just that way. But he didn't, at least as far as I knew, exhibit those things in the shelter. But as I said, maybe they knew and they didn't tell me. So these are things you have to keep in mind. So the advice I would give anybody is, if you're looking, I would, especially this individual who is visually impaired, if I'm walking through a shelter, I want to look for a very calm dog. I want to look for a dog who's not as bothered by all the noise and stress, or minimally bothered, who doesn't seem all that affected by it, if possible. I would look for a dog who doesn't exhibit pushy tendencies or has a dominant personality, that doesn't seek to control the people or the environment. You know, Kaylee was the opposite of Bruno when I met her. She was more timid and scared. Bruno was more forward-moving, pushy, confident, wanted to take things out of my hand, didn't really want to listen. Put him on the leash, he wanted to pull. Kaylee was the opposite. Kaylee didn't really want to. Even the day I adopted her, I brought her out to the car. She didn't want to get in the car. She was very resistant. I would look more for a resistant dog, because no trust has been built there, than a dog who's very forward-moving, kind of wants to push you out of the way or try to push you around, or is seeking to control things. Now, let's say you find a dog you resonate with and everything is looking good, but maybe the dog's a little pushy. What I would look for then is, if you try to assert a boundary, how does that dog respond? Like if a dog jumps on me and I push it down, how persistent is that dog going to be? If I push it down a couple times and it listens, it gets the point, and it begins to respect my space, okay, we can work with that. I would say that's a green flag. That would be a good thing. But if a dog's jumping on you and you're meeting it, and you got to keep pushing it, and it's like very persistent, it wouldn't be a dog I would consider. I would want to look for a dog who, if it does have pushy tendencies, you can assert yourself, and that dog is pretty quick to listen, wants to follow, is going to adhere to the boundaries you're establishing. Try to look for a more submissive-minded dog. Look for a dog who is looking, maybe wants to go with the flow more than be in charge. And as I said before, don't look for this grand connection. I think people build these things up in their mind. I'm looking for that dog that I really connect with, and I really, there's a spark that I wouldn't go down that road. I almost passed Gray Goose up. When I saw her pictures online, I was like, it was kind of the same thing as Kaylee, where I was like, because I already had another bulldog in mind that I really wanted to meet, but when I filled out the application, they said, well, she's already been adopted, and I was like, fuck. So I started looking, and I found Gray Goose, and I was initially like, I wasn't as excited as the first dog. And then I took a couple days to think about it. I decided to fill out an application, and they originally denied me, actually. Now, I could have let it go there, but the grounds on which they were denying me were not accurate. So I actually sent them an email kind of fighting back a little bit. And they had said somebody was going to adopt her too, that she was up for adoption. But then they emailed me back a couple days later and said, hey, we're going to give you a meeting. And I wasn't sure what changed, but they said you have till tomorrow night at 8 o'clock to email email us back because the meeting was a few days in the future. Otherwise, we're gonna pass you up and go on to somebody else. So I emailed them the next day at 6:45 p.m. because I was going back and forth because it was one of those situations where they give you a meeting, and if it goes well, then they just give you the dog. And I was like, that's awful quick. I was a bit put off by that. You know, if they were saying like, we're going to give you a meeting, give you some time to think about it, I would have been a lot more open to it. But that was the circumstance, and I was like, I don't know if I want to do it that fast. So at 6:45, I emailed them back, said, you know what, I'll take the meeting. And then it was, we went there that Saturday, and I saw Grey Goose, and she was the calmest dog. You know, it was at an animal hospital. There's puppies there, dogs barking, kids around making, I mean, it was noisy, but she was just sitting there, very stoic, not bothered by anything. Now, she was resistant in the fact that when I tried to take her for a walk, because her foster was telling me she doesn't want to walk, she doesn't want to follow. When I bring her outside, she just wants to run back to the house. So she gave me a leash, she's like, well, you have to take her out, you know, see what you think. So I took her out, and the videos are on my, you can go to my short section, you can see the video the first time I took Grey Goose out for a walk. She didn't want to follow me. She resisted. She was like Kaylee. She wanted to run back to the animal hospital. But I was sold because I saw the potential in her, and I really liked the fact that she was so calm, stoic, stable-minded. I really liked her energy. She wasn't being pushy or demanding. She was trying to avoid. I would rather take a dog who's being avoidant rather than pushy. And she had her little, you know, now I can't think of the medical term, but the blisters between her paws. So we took her into the vet, and they were examining her, and I got to see how well she did in that setting too. And she was extremely calm. Did put up no fuss. There was no issues there. So I was like, yeah, you know what? I'm taking her home. And Grey Goose is, you know, obviously you've all seen the videos. She's an incredible dog. So two of the dogs that I adopted were both avoidant, resistant, didn't want to follow at first. And Bruno, who to this day is still the most difficult dog I've ever handled or worked with, and I lived with him. The most aggressive dog I've ever worked with, and I lived with him. When I met him, he was very forward-moving, very pushy, demanding, didn't want to listen, so on and so forth. So those would be the distinction. I would make those distinctions between there's the dominant personalities that are very pushy, forward-moving, very confident, don't want to listen, very assertive, and the more submissive-minded who are, you know, they might be a little scared, they might be resistant, they might just not want to follow you at first, they don't trust you. But I would also look for them being calm, stable-minded, and willing to adhere to boundaries if you establish them. Those would be the things I would look for. But as I've said, it's a crapshoot when you're going through the shelters looking for a dog. You know, I can give you all the advice in the world, but you're just never really gonna know till you take that dog home and you spend a couple weeks with it, and that dog starts to come out of its shell. Now, there are things you can do to help that process along and maybe avoid some of the pitfalls, because as I've said in other videos, the relationship that you're establishing with that dog begins immediately. From the moment you meet that dog and when you adopt it, the moment you get that dog in your car or on a leash to your car and you go home, you are now establishing some kind of relationship dynamic. So you have to be aware of that. And if you do those things in the right way, that can greatly increase your chances of when that dog starts to come around a little bit, come out of its shell, that you may avoid some of the problems that a lot of the other people have because they're not aware of it. And they're not aware of how to do that correctly. So that way the dog, it sees you as an authority figure and a leader, and you establish a leader-follower dynamic rather than, you know, the dog being in charge, the dog leading, and it's flipped. That's when you have problems. So anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. This video is for a specific individual, but hopefully, I don't know, maybe this can help somebody else if you're thinking of adopting a dog. I know it's lengthy, but it is what it is. Anyway, y'all have a great day.